The fog clung to the peaks of the Sutherland Mountains like a damp, discarded wool blanket. It was the kind of morning in Loch that suggested the world had simply given up and decided to stay in bed, a sentiment Police Constable Hamish Macbeth shared entirely. Hamish stood by the edge of the Loch, his tall, lanky frame shrouded in an old waterproof jacket that had seen better decades. His shock of ginger hair was dampened by the mist, and his hazel eyes were fixed with predatory intensity not on a criminal, but on a ripple in the dark, peat-stained water. In his hand was a fishing rod that officially didn't exist, and at his feet sat Lugs, a dog of such indeterminate breed and spectacular ugliness that he appeared to be made of spare parts. "Easy now, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his soft Highland drawl barely audible over the lap of the water. "If we catch this one, it's poached salmon for breakfast, and DCI Blair needn't be any the wiser about where it came from." Lugs offered a skeptical huff. The dog knew, as well as Hamish did, that the fish in this stretch of the water technically belonged to the local estate, but Hamish considered it a form of local taxation. He was just about to cast when the silence was shattered not by a splash, but by the obnoxious, high-pitched whine of a precision-engineered German engine. A silver sports car, utterly ill-suited for the single-track roads of the Highlands, roared over the rise, its tyres crunching violently against the gravel. It came to a screeching halt near the old stone bridge, narrowly missing a wandering sheep that didn't even have the grace to look startled. Out stepped a man who looked like he had been gift-trapped by an expensive London tailor who secretly hated him. He wore a crisp, white linen suit entirely optimistic, given the Scottish drizzleland leather loafers that cost more than Hamish earned in a month. "You there! Constable!" the man shouted, waving a manicured hand. "Is this the way to the Peveril estate?" "My GPS has been screaming at me in German for the last 10 miles, and I'm convinced this road is actually a goat path." Hamish sighed, slowly lowering his rod and resting it against a rock. He adopted his most vacant, slow-witted expression, one that usually convinced outsiders he was about as sharp as a bowl of porridge. "It is a road, sir," Hamish said, his voice thickening with a deliberate, rustic burr, "though the sheep have the right of way. You'll be Mr. Montgomery, I take it, the one who bought the old Croft house." "Julian Montgomery," the man corrected, stepping gingerly over a puddle as if it contained toxic waste. "And it's not a Croft house anymore. I've had architects in. It's a Highland retreat, though why anyone would retreat to a place where the air feels like a wet sponge is beyond me. Are all the locals this stationary?" "We find it saves energy, sir," Hamish replied mildly. "The Peveril estate is another 3 miles up the glen, but you'll want to watch the bend by the standing stones. The mist makes it look like the road goes straight, but the loch says otherwise." Montgomery scoffed, checking his gold watch. "Dreadful. Absolutely primitive. I don't know how you people stand it. No signal, no decent espresso, and I haven't seen a soul who doesn't look like Thea related to their own cow." He climbed back into the car without a word of thanks, the engine roaring again as he sped off, leaving a cloud of exhaust fumes to mingle with the ancient Highland mist. Hamish watched the silver speck disappear into the grey. A charming addition to the village, wouldn't you say? "Lugs," the dog let out a low, mournful growl. Hamish reached for his rod again, but the mood was broken. The salmon had moved on, likely scared off by the vibration of the sports car. He felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck, a sensation that usually preceded a great deal of paperwork and a red-faced shouting match with his superiors. In Loch, people like Julian Montgomery didn't just arrive, they collided with the landscape. And usually, the landscape won. Hamish didn't have to wait long for the scenery to return. The lingering scent of expensive exhaust had barely dissipated into the damp Highland air when the sound of a distant metallic crunch echoed through the glen. It wasn't the sharp crack of a hunting rifle or the low rumble of a shifting scree slope. It was the unmistakable, discordant symphony of luxury German engineering meeting ancient Scottish granite. Lugs pricked up his ragged ears and let out a low, mournful whine that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Hamish's bones. With a heavy sigh that carried the weight of a man who knew his peaceful morning had just been traded for a mountain of Strathbane paperwork, Hamish dismantled his rod and began the long uphill trek toward the bend by the standing stones. The fog had thickened, turning the world into a monochromatic landscape of grey and charcoal. As Hamish rounded the sharpest curve of the Glen Road, the silver sports car came into view. It hadn't quite made it into the loch, but it had certainly tried its best. The vehicle was perched precariously on a ledge of jagged rock, its front crumpled like a discarded soda can against the base of a Neolithic monolith. Steam hissed from the radiator, mingling with the mist in a ghostly dance. The driver's door swung wide, flapping rhythmically in the rising wind, but the seat was empty. "Mr. Montgomery?" Hamish shouted, his voice sounding thin and small against the vast silence of the hills. "Are you all right, sir?" There was no answer. Hamish moved closer, his boots crunching on the shattered safety glass that sparkled like diamonds on the black tarmac. He peered into the footwell, half expecting to see a dazed Londoner clutching a shattered smartphone, but the interior was pristine, save for a stray leather driving glove and the faint, lingering aroma of an overpriced cologne. It was then that Lugs began to growl a deep, guttural sound that started in his chest and ended in a sharp, frantic bark. The dog was staring down toward the water's edge, where the bank dropped sharply into a dark, reedy pool. Hamish scrambled down the embankment, his long legs navigating the slick heather with the practiced ease of a man born to these hills. He found Julian Montgomery roughly 20 yards from the wreck. The man was not lying in a dignified heap, nor was he clutching a dramatic wound. Instead, he was draped backward over a moss-covered boulder in a manner that was profoundly humiliating. His expensive linen suit was sodden and stained a deep, muddy green from the peat, and his head was submerged in a shallow, bubbling spring that fed into the Loch. Hamish reached down, grabbing the man's shoulder to pull him clear, but he knew before he even felt the cold, stiffening flesh that Julian Montgomery would never worry about his GPS again. As he rolled the body over, a flash of something bright caught the light. Protruding from the center of Montgomery's chest was a silver-handled gralloching knife of kind used by deer stalkers to disembowel a stag. It was a clean, professional strike, executed with a chilling lack of emotion. But what made the scene truly bizarre was the garnish. Resting atop the dead man's open mouth was a single, perfectly preserved sprig of white heather, and tucked into his breast pocket, where a silk handkerchief should have been, was a soggy, half-eaten mutton pie from the Loch bakery. "Och, man," Hamish muttered, pushing his peaked cap back and scratching his red hair. "You couldn't just have an accident, could you? You had to go and get yourself murdered in the middle of my day off." He stood up, looking around at the desolate circle of stones. The mist was closing in, swallowing the road and the car, leaving Hamish alone with a dead Sassenach and a dog who was currently trying to sniff the mutton pie in the victim's pocket. It wasn't just a killing, it was a statement. The placement of the pie was a mocking touch, a local insult levelled at a man who had looked down his nose at the village's primitive ways. Hamish didn't need a forensic lab to tell him that the killer was likely someone Montgomery had insulted within the last hour, or perhaps someone who had been waiting for him to finally drive his silver vanity project into the heart of their territory. The peace of Loch was officially shattered. Within the hour, the quiet glen would be swarming with the heavy-booted detectives from Strathbane, led by the perpetually furious DCI Blair. Hamish looked at the body one last time, noting the angle of the knife and the way the grass had been trampled nearby. Someone had been very angry, or very cold-blooded, probably both. With a heavy heart, Hamish reached into his pocket for his radio. He knew that as soon as he keyed that mic, his life in the Highlands would become a misery of shouting, insults, and the inevitable demand for his promotion to a city precinct of fate he feared far more than any murderer lurking in the fog. Locked up to base, he droned into the device, his voice flat. "I've got a dead one out by the stones, and tell the canteen to put a pot of coffee on. It's going to be a long winter." The crackle of the radio had barely faded when the distant, aggressive wail of sirens began to tear through the Highland silence, signalling the end of any hope for a quiet morning. Hamish remained by the body, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching the mist swirl around the crumpled silver car. He had already noted the lack of scuff marks on the road. Montgomery hadn't braked head, been forced, or startled off the path. Lugg sat stoically by his side, occasionally casting a longing glance at the mutton pie still nestled in the dead man's pocket. The dog's ears suddenly flattened against his head, a reliable early warning system for the arrival of something truly unpleasant. A fleet of police vehicles from Strathbane rounded the bend, led by a mud-splattered Vauxhall that took the corner with a reckless disregard for the suspension. The car screeched to a halt, and DCI Blair exploded from the driver's seat before the engine had even stopped rattling. He was a man who seemed to be composed entirely of high blood pressure and cheap polyester. His face was already a shade of alarming purple, his small, piddy eyes darting from the wrecked sports car to the lanky figure of Hamish Macbeth. Behind him trailed his usual shadows, Detectives Anderson and MacNab, who looked like they would rather be anywhere else than in the middle of a damp glen with their volatile superior. Blair stomped across the heather, his heavy brogues sinking into the peat with every angry step, his breath coming in ragged, tobacco-stained puffs that clouded in the cold air. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice echoing off the standing stones like a foghorn. "I might have known. Every time a body drops in this god-forsaken wilderness, I find you standing over it like a ginger vulture." What have you done to the crime scene? I suppose you've already trampled over every piece of evidence while looking for a place to have a nap. Hamish didn't move, keeping his expression carefully blank and his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeated laziness. I've touched nothing but the gentleman's shoulder to see if there was breath in him. Sir, he replied, his accent becoming broader and more rhythmic, a tactical choice designed to irritate Blair's urban sensibilities. And I kept Lugs back, though the poor beast is quite disturbed by the whole affair. It's a sad business, DCI Blair, a man in a fine suit, ruined by a bit of bad luck and a sharp bit of steel. Blair ignored him, shoving past to look at the body. He let out a sharp, derisive laugh when he saw the mutton pie. A pie? You're telling me a professional hit was carried out with a snack for a souvenir? Don't be ridiculous, Macbeth. This is clearly a local job. Some disgruntled crofters with a grudge against the English. It's primitive, it's messy, and it's exactly the kind of thick-headed crime I expect from this village. He stood up, pointing a stubby finger at the silver car. Look at that car. It's worth more than your entire station house. This Montgomery fellow probably cut someone off on the road, and some Highland savage decided to play William Tell with a hunting knife. It's a gralloching knife, sir, Hamish corrected softly, his eyes tracing the line from the car to the boulder. Used for deer. And the white heather is a strange touch, wouldn't you say? It's meant to be lucky, but it's not brought much luck to Mr. Montgomery. I don't pay you to be a botanist or a philosopher. Macbeth, Blair snapped, his face leaning dangerously close to Hamish's. I pay Eutho God knows Whito keep the peace. Which you've failed to do. Again, this is a high-profile victim. Montgomery was a property developer with friends in Edinburgh. This needs a real detective, not a glorified sheepdog in a peaked cap. Anderson, MacNab, get the tape up. Start questioning the nearest houses. I want a list of every person who owns a knife like that within a 10-mile radius. That would be everyone with a kitchen and a pair of hands, sir, Hamish muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Blair to catch the insolence. Blair's neck turned a deeper shade of crimson. Get out of my sight, Macbeth. Back to your little police station and stay by the phone. If I find out you've been investigating on your own, I'll have you transferred to a desk in Glasgow so fast your head will spin. You're a witness now, nothing more. A useless, redundant witness. Now, move. Hamish nodded obediently, touching the brim of his cap in a gesture that looked respectful but felt like a dismissal. He whistled for Lugs and began to walk away, his pace slow and steady. He didn't mind being sidelined, in fact, it was exactly what he needed. While Blair stayed at the scene shouting at the mist and intimidating the grass, the real story would unfold in the kitchens and bars of Loch. The pie was a message, and the heather was a symbol, and neither of them were meant for the police from Strathbane. They were meant for the village. As he climbed back toward the road, Hamish felt the familiar, cold pull of a mystery. He knew he wouldn't be staying by the phone. There were scones to be eaten and gossip to be gathered, and Blair's loud-mouthed incompetence had just given him the perfect cover to start mooching for the truth. Hamish watched through his rearview mirror as Blair continued to gesticulate wildly at the fog, his silhouette looking like a frantic beetle against the ancient stones. The constable didn't drive straight back to the station. Instead, he steered his aging Land Rover toward the village centre, the engine rattling in a comforting rhythm that matched the ticking of his thoughts. He knew Blair would spend the next 3 hours demanding tyre impressions from a road made of flint and granite, which left Hamish with a narrow window to tap into the real information network of Loch. He parked near the harbour, where the smell of salt and old rope hung heavy in the air, and made his way toward the Highland deli and curry shop. It was an unusual establishment, born of a marriage between a local girl and a man from Glasgow, and it served as the unofficial clearinghouse for every secret north of Inverness. As the bell above the door chimed, the rich, aromatic scent of turmeric and cumin collided with the buttery smell of fresh shortbread. Patel, the owner, was already leaning over the counter, his eyes wide with the sort of suppressed excitement that usually followed a major event. He didn't even wait for Hamish to reach the counter before he began pouring a cup of thick, syrupy tea. Lugs squeezed under a corner table, resting his chin on his paws, knowing from experience that this was going to be a long sitting. Terrible business out by the stones, Hamish, Patel said, sliding the tea across the formica top. The village is humming like a disturbed hive. They say a man in a silver car has met a very sharp end. One of the holiday home crowd, was it? Hamish took a slow, appreciative sip of the tea, letting the warmth settle his nerves. It was Mr. Montgomery, Patel. A man with a very expensive suit and a very short temper. He seemed to have a way of making enemies before Head even finished introducing himself. He paused, looking thoughtfully at a tray of mutton pies cooling on a wire rack nearby. Tell me, did Mr. Montgomery ever stop here? Or perhaps someone was talking about him. He was doing some building work up at the old croft. Patel leaned in closer, lowering his voice despite the shop being empty. He came in once, complained that the curry wasn't authentic, and then had the gall to tell me my prices were extortionate for a village with no streetlights. But it wasn't just his mouth, Hamish. There's been talk among the tradesmen. He refused to pay the local stonemason, Geordie, for the wall repairs. Said the work was rustic and substandard. Geordie was in here yesterday morning, redder than a boiled lobster, saying that if Montgomery didn't pay up, he'd find a way to settle the debt that didn't involve the Scottish legal system. Hamish nodded slowly. Geordie was a man of few words and a very large hammer, but he wasn't the type to use a gralloching knife. That required a certain finesse. And the pie, Patel. Have you sold many mutton pies this morning? Specifically to someone who might want to leave one as a parting gift. Patel looked at his cooling rack and then back at Hamish, a flicker of realization crossing his face. Mrs. Wellington bought 4 at 8 o'clock, and young Jamie, the gillie from the Peveril estate, took a couple for his lunch. But here is the strange Thinggold Archie, the one who lives in the caravan down by the inlet, came in and asked for a pie that was just a bit past its best. I told him I didn't sell rubbish, but he insisted on taking one that had been sitting out since yesterday. He said it was for a friend who wouldn't mind the crust being a bit soft. Hamish's ears pricked up. Archie was a man who knew every deer path and poaching hole in the Highlands. If anyone knew about gralloching knives and the exact location of the best white heather, it was Archie. But Archie was also a man who lived on the fringes of the law and hated the police with a passion that bordered on the religious. He certainly wouldn't talk to Blair, but he might talk to a man who had shared a dream of poached salmon with him in the past. "Thank you, Patel. You've been a help, as always," Hamish said, reaching into his pocket for a few coins. Patel waved them away, eyes already darting to the window as a group of village women approached, clearly looking for their own update on the morning's tragedy. Hamish whistled for lugs and retreated into the drizzle. The investigation was moving, but not in the direction Blair would ever understand. The DCI would be looking for financial records and phone logs, but Hamish was looking at the price of a stale pie and the pride of a stonemason. As he walked back to the Land Rover, he spotted a familiar, elegant figure standing by the post office. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe, looking as cool and untouchable as the mountain peaks, was watching the police activity with a furrowed brow. If Montgomery had been dealing in property, he would have crossed paths with the Halberton-Smythes eventually. It was time for a casual chat with the aristocracy. Hamish adjusted his cap, feeling the familiar, hollow ache in his chest that always accompanied a sighting of Priscilla Halberton-Smythe. She stood by the stone pillar of the post office, her blonde hair tucked neatly under a tweed hat, looking every bit the daughter of the local gentry. While the rest of the village was buzzing with the frantic, messy energy of the murder, Priscilla remained a pocket of calm, though her eyes clear and sharp as a Highland spring were fixed on the blue flashing lights reflecting off the Loch. As Hamish approached with lugs trailing behind, she turned, a small, knowing smile touching her lips that made him feel even more like a clumsy schoolboy than usual. "I imagine DCI Blair has already told you that your services are entirely unnecessary. Hamish?" she asked, her voice light but carrying that refined edge of the upper class. "I saw him shouting at the mist earlier." He's turned into a quite spectacular shade of fuchsia. "He's in a fine temper, Priscilla," Hamish replied, leaning against the damp stone wall and adopting his most nonchalant air. "He seems convinced that a local revolution has started, led by someone with a taste for mutton pies. But it's a nasty business. Julian Montgomery wasn't a man to go quietly, it seems." Priscilla's expression shifted, a shadow of genuine distaste crossing her fine features. Julian was a man who didn't believe in quiet. "He's been hovering around my father for months, trying to wheedle his way into the estate's land holdings. He had this dreadful vision of turning the North Ridge into a series of ecolodge-glass boxes that would have looked like spaceships had crashed into the heather. My father loathed him, sure, but Julian was persistent. He had a way of finding people's vulnerabilities and pressing on them until they gave in just to make him stop talking." Hamish watched a group of tourists scurry toward the hotel, their bright plastic ponchos rustling in the wind. "Did he have any particular vulnerabilities he was pressing on lately? Aside from your father's patience?" Priscilla looked away, her gaze drifting toward the Peveril estate. "He was involved with Elspeth Grant for a brief period, or at least, he thought he was. Elspeth, being Elspeth, was mostly interested in the fact that he owned a gallery in London and might be persuaded to show her photographs. But when she realized he was more interested in using her local connections to bypass the planning committee, she abandoned him rather spectacularly. Last I heard, He was threatening to sue her for some imagined breach of contract regarding the promotional shots she'd taken of his Highland retreat. A man who sues for a broken heart or a broken contract makes a lot of noise, Hamish mused, his mind cataloguing the connection. Elspeth Grant was a firebrand, a woman whose temper matched Hamish's own for intensity, though she lacked his patience. If Montgomery had been threatening her career or her reputation, she wouldn't have gone to the police. She would have handled it with a very sharp tongue, and perhaps something more. There's something else, Hamish, Priscilla added, stepping closer so her voice wouldn't carry. Yesterday, at the hotel, I saw Julian arguing with a woman. She wasn't a local. She looked expensive, tired, and very angry. They were speaking in low voices, but I caught the word insurance. Julian looked terrified, the only time I've ever seen him without that smug London armour of his. He left the hotel in a blind rage, nearly knocking over a tray of tea. Hamish filed the insurance comment away next to the mutton pie and the white heather. Insurance is a cold word for a hot day, Priscilla, and it doesn't quite fit with the image of a man being killed by a local with a deer knife. Perhaps, she said, her eyes searching for him. But remember, Hamish, people in Loch have long memories, but people like Julian have long trails of debt. Don't let Blair bully you into looking only at the villagers. Julian was running away from something long before he hit that stone. She reached out and patted Lugs, who gave a traitorous wag of his tail. Come by the house later. Hamish, my father is in a state, and I've made a fresh pot of coffee. Real coffee, not that instant sludge you drink at the station. Hamish watched her walk away, her stride purposeful and elegant. He felt the familiar tug of longing, but it was quickly superseded by the puzzle pieces clicking into place. Elspeth, the angry woman at the hotel, the insurance, and Archie's stale pie. The social dynamics of the upper class were often as murky as the bottom of the Loch, but they followed a logic of their own. He needed to find Elspeth before Blair did. More importantly, he needed to find out why a London developer was terrified of a word like insurance in the middle of the Highlands. He whistled for Lugs, his mind already racing ahead to the old schoolhouse where Elspeth kept her darkroom. The romantic complications would have to wait. There was a killer who understood the village's symbols a little too well, and Hamish was beginning to suspect that the Sassenach hadn't been the only outsider with a secret. Hamish watched the tail of Priscilla's skirt vanish around the corner of the post office, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering briefly in the damp air before being reclaimed by the smell of wet wool and peat. He stood for a moment, his thumb hooked in his belt, weighing the two paths before him. He could follow the trail of the insurance woman Priscilla had mentioned, or he could check in on Elspeth Grant. However, as he turned toward his Land Rover, the decision was made for him by the sight of DCI Blair's car screaming back into the village square, followed closely by a police van. Blair leaped out before the vehicle had even settled, his face a triumphant, pulsing shade of violet that suggested he had finally found someone to bully. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, ignoring the startled tourists nearby. "I told you to stay by the phone, you ginger idler. But it doesn't matter now. We've got him. Case closed, and not thanks to any of your local intuition. We found the weapon, and we found the man who owns it." Hamish felt a cold, sinking sensation in his stomach. "And who would that be, sir?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Geordie the stonemason!" Blair barked, rubbing his hands with a predatory glee. We searched his shed. Found a set of gralloching knives with one missing from the roll and a pair of boots caked in the exact same clay found at the standing stones. Apparently, our friend Geordie had a public row with Montgomery over a bill. Motive, means, and opportunity. I have Anderson and MacNab bringing him now. He was hiding in the back of the pub like the guilty peasant he is. Hamish watched as the police van doors opened and Geordie was led out in handcuffs. The stonemason looked less like a cold-blooded killer and more like a man who had been hit over the head with one of his own lintels. He was pale, shaking, and his eyes were wide with a bewildered terror. As he passed Hamish, he let out a strangled plea. "I did, Hamish. I was angry, but I was at the quarry all morning. The knives, someone must have taken it." "Shut up," Blair snapped, shoving the man toward the station. "Save it for the lawyers in Strathbane. Macbeth, you're to process the paperwork. Try not to smudge it with your breakfast." Hamish remained on the pavement, his eyes narrowing as he watched the procession. On the surface, it was perfect. Geordie had the temper, the tools, and the grievance. But as Hamish looked at the boots Blair had mentioned Etno sitting in a plastic evidence bag in the back of the van, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The clay on the boots was thick and orange, the heavy till found at the deep quarry. But the mud at the standing stones, where Montgomery's body had been draped, was a dark, peaty black, mixed with the fine grey silt of the Loch shore. Had Geordie been on stage, his boots would have told another story. Furthermore, Geordie was a man who prided himself on his tools. He would never have left a knife behind, and he certainly wouldn't have known or cared about the symbolic placement of a mutton pie. The pie was the key. It was a local's signature, but it was being used by someone who wanted the police to think exactly what Blair was thinking. It was a caricature of a Highland crime. "Lugs!" Hamish whispered, the dog looking up with a shark intelligence that Blair would never credit. Geordie couldn't kill a fly without apologising to it afterward. Someone has been very busy in that man's shed, and they've been even busier making sure the lazy policeman didn't look too closely. He waited until Blair had vanished into the station to begin his celebratory phone calls to headquarters. Moving quickly, Hamish didn't head for the station. Instead, he walked toward the back of the village, where a small, overgrown path led toward the old schoolhouse. If Elspeth Grant had been Montgomery's photographer, she might have captured more than just the architecture of his Highland retreat. And if Julian was running scared because of insurance, it wasn't a policy at a banquet was a piece of evidence. Hamish realised with a start that the red herring wasn't just Geordie, it was the entire local grudge narrative. The killer hadn't just murdered Montgomery, they had staged a play for an audience of one. DCI Blair. And Blair, in his arrogance, had followed the script perfectly. As Hamish reached the schoolhouse door, he saw a flash of movement in the window. Someone was inside, and they weren't developing photos. The subtle clue of the mismatched mud had opened a door, and Hamish Macbeth was about to walk through it, leaving the real detectives to congratulate themselves on an arrest that was as hollow as a Highland winter. The gate to the old schoolhouse creaked with a high, rusted protest as Hamish stepped through, lugs pressing close to his heels. The movement head seen in the window had been fleeting, a mere shiver of a curtain, but it was enough to tell him that Elspeth Grant was either hiding or being visited by someone who didn't want to be seen. As he approached the heavy oak door, the air felt thick with the chemical tang of developing fluid and the damp, earthy scent of the encroaching woods. He didn't knock with the authority of a policeman. Instead, he gave a light, rhythmic tap that suggested a neighbourly visit rather than a formal interrogation. The door opened only a crack. Elspeth's face appeared in the shadows, her dark hair wild and her eyes rimmed with the telltale redness of someone who had spent the last few hours in a dark room in a state of quiet panic. When she saw it was Hamish, her shoulders dropped, but the tension didn't leave her mouth. "They've arrested Geordie, Hamish," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I saw the van from the ridge. It's madness. Geordie wouldn't hurt a sheep, let alone a man like Julian." "I know that, Elspeth, and you know that," Hamish said softly, gently nudging the door open further until she stepped back to let him in. The room was cluttered with tripods, lenses, and drying lines of black and white prints. But DCI Blair likes a simple story, and a stonemason with a grudge fits the page perfectly. I am looking for a more complicated story. The one Priscilla mentioned, something about insurance and a woman at the hotel. Elspeth turned away, walking to a long table littered with contact sheets. She picked up a magnifying loupe, her hands trembling slightly. Julian wasn't a property developer. Hamish, not really. He was a professional parasite. He'd find historic estates with tax troubles, promise them the moon in investment, and then use the land as collateral for massive loans that head funnel into offshore accounts. The insurance he was terrified of wasn't a policy. It was a digital ledger record of everyone he'd bribed to get the planning permissions through, including some very powerful people in the Scottish Land Commission. She slid a photograph across the table toward him. It wasn't a landscape or a portrait of the Highland retreat. It was a telephoto shot taken from a distance, showing Julian Montgomery standing by the Loch, handing a thick envelope to a woman whose face was partially obscured by a silk scarf. "That was taken 3 days ago," Elspeth said. "That's Mrs. Catherine Peveril. She's not just the owner of the estate Julian was developing, she's the one who introduced him to the Highland council members. She thought she was partnering with him, but Julian was blackmailing her. Head found out the Peveril estate was essentially bankrupt, and that shed forged her late husband's signature on the sale of the North Ridge." Hamish studied the photo. The motive wasn't the petty anger of a stonemason or the jealousy of a spurned lover. It was the cold, calculated preservation of a legacy. Catherine Peveril belonged to a world where social embarrassment was a fate worse than death. If Montgomery was going to expose her to save his own skin from the insurance, woman likely, a private investigator, hired by his creditors, would have had to act. The pie, Elspeth, Hamish mused, his mind circling back to the humiliating scene by the stones. And the white heather. It was too perfect, wasn't it? A stag hunting knife, a local snack, a Highland symbol. It was meant to look like the work of a savage local because that's exactly what an aristocrat thinks of the people in Loch. They don't see individuals, they see a backdrop of peasants. Mrs. Peveril didn't just kill him, she tried to frame the entire village culture. She's desperate, Hamish, Elspeth said, finally looking him in the eye. She came here this morning, before you found him. She knew I had the photos. She didn't threaten Mesh offered to buy my career. A gallery in Edinburgh, a book deal. All I had to do was hand over the negatives and the digital drives. I told her I needed time to think, but I know she won't wait. She's at the estate now, probably watching the police through her binoculars and laughing at Blair. Hamish felt a spark of anger beneath his calm exterior. He looked at Luggs, who let out a low growl as if sensing the shift in the room. The crime wasn't about money or robbery. It was about the arrogance of someone who thought they could murder a man and then discard a local workman like Geordie as if he were nothing more than a broken tool. Mrs. Peveril had underestimated the village, but more importantly, she had underestimated the lazy policeman who spent his days drinking tea and listening to what people didn't say. "Stay here, Elspeth," Hamish commanded, his voice losing its casual lilt and taking on a hard, authoritative edge. "Lock the door and don't answer it for anyone but me, not even Blair." He pocketed the photograph, his mind already spinning a web of his own. He needed to set a trap, one that would force a woman of Catherine Peveril's standing to reveal the blood on her hands before Blair could ship Geordie off to a holding cell in Strathbane. The hunt was no longer for a poacher, it was for the lady of the manor. The heavy iron gates of the Peveril estate were slick with the persistent Highland mist as Hamish steered the Land Rover up the long, winding drive. He didn't approach with sirens or a display of force. Instead, he drove slowly, allowing the crunch of gravel to announce his arrival long before he reached the manor house. He knew Catherine Peveril would be watching from the tall, narrow windows of the drawing-room, a woman accustomed to overlooking her kingdom. Beside him, Luggs sat upright, his nose twitching at the scent of wood smoke and old stone. Hamish checked his pocket once more, ensuring the photograph Elspeth had given him was tucked safely away. He wasn't here to make a formal arrest, not yet. He was here to play the part of the slow-witted local constable, the one man Mrs. Peveril would feel comfortable enough to manipulate. He found her in the library, a room that smelled of leather-bound books and the cold, sharp tang of gin. She was dressed in an impeccable tweed suit, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, looking every bit the grieving business associate. As Hamish entered, removing his cap and twisting it nervously in his hands, she didn't rise from her armchair. She simply watched him with an air of weary patience that would have intimidated a lesser man. "Constable Macbeth," she said, her voice a smooth, cultured purr. "I heard the news about poor Julian. It's a tragedy for the Glen, and quite a shock for the estate. I understand DCI Blair has already apprehended the culprit, that stonemason fellow, wasn't it? Such a shame that tempers run so high among the locals." "It is a tragedy indeed, Mrs. Peveril," Hamish replied, his voice thick with a deceptive rural hesitation. He sat on the edge of a stiff-backed chair, looking around the room with wide, impressed eyes. "Mr. Blair is very sure of himself. He's already calling the papers in Strathbane. But I am a bit worried, you see. I keep thinking about that mutton pie we found on the body. It's been bothering me with something terrible." Catherine Peveril tilted her head, a faint, condescending smile touching her lips. "A pie, Constable? Surely that's just a bit of local thuggery. A crude insult from a crude man." "Aye, that's what the DCI says." Hamish nodded vigorously. "But the thing is, the pie was stale. Someone who wanted it to look like a villager's lunch bought it from Patel's shop yesterday. And then there's the matter of the white heather. It's a bit early in the season for such a fine spring, unless someone had access to a private greenhouse like the one you have out back by the rose garden." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Peveril's eyes didn't flicker, but the hand holding her crystal glass tightened until her knuckles turned white. "Are you suggesting something, Macbeth? I find your tone remarkably familiar for a man in your position." "Oh, no, Ma'am," Hamish said, leaning forward and lowering his voice, as if sharing a confidence. "I am just worried for the village. You see, I found something else, a photograph. It shows Mr. Montgomery meeting a woman by the Loch, a woman who looked very much like yourself. DCI Blair hasn't seen it yet. I thought it best to bring it to you first. After all, if the insurance people Julian was scared of getting a hold of it, they might start asking questions about the Peveril land titles. It would be a terrible scandal for a family like yours." He watched the trap snap shut. The mention of insurance, very word Priscilla had overheard, struck home like a physical blow. Mrs. Peveril stood up, her composure finally fracturing. She saw not a threat, but an opportunity to silence the last remaining loose end. She assumed Hamish was looking for a bribe, a way to keep his quiet life in Loch funded by her desperation. "You're..." Clever man in your own way, Macbeth, she whispered, her voice cold and sharp. Much cleverer than that buffoon Blair. How much do you want? Or perhaps You'd prefer the negatives that Elspeth Grant is so foolishly holding on to. I can ensure your lazy lifestyle remains undisturbed for a very long time. I am not sure about money, Mum, Hamish said, standing up and backing toward the door, appearing flustered. I am just a simple policeman, but I've left the photograph in the old boathouse by the pier. I was too nervous to keep it on me. If you want to discuss how we settle this, perhaps you should meet me there in an hour, away from the DCI's prying eyes. The boathouse, she repeated, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the risks. To her, Hamish was a peasant trying to play a high-stakes game. She believed she could easily overwhelm or outmaneuver him in the dark of the Loch side. An hour then, Constable. Do not be late, and do not bring that dog. Hamish nodded, clutching his cap to his chest as he hurried out of the room. As soon as he was back in the Land Rover and out of sight of the manor windows, his fearful expression vanished, replaced by a grim, focused intensity. He hadn't left the photo in the boathouse, he had left a recording device, and a very clear trail for Blair's subordinates to follow. He had played on her arrogance, her belief that a Highlander could always be bought or bullied. Now, he just had to ensure the confrontation happened on his terms, before the lady of the manor decided that one murder wasn't enough to secure her legacy. The mist had transformed from a damp blanket into a swirling, treacherous wall of grey by the time Hamish reached the old stone boathouse. The structure sat low against the black water of the Loch, its wood rotted by decades of Highland rain, and its interior smelling of salt, diesel, and ancient secrets. He didn't park the Land Rover nearby instead. He left it tucked behind a stand of gnarled rowan trees half a mile back, approaching the water's edge on foot with the silent, ghost-like tread of a practiced poacher. Lugs followed, though the dog's hackles were raised, his ears twitching at every creak of the timber pier. Hamish entered the boathouse, the darkness swallowing him. He didn't turn on a light, he simply waited, his back against a cold stone pillar, feeling the rhythmic lap of the Loch against the pilings beneath his boots. He didn't have to wait long. The sound of a car, engine smooth, expensive, and quiet approached the pier, followed by the sharp click of heels on the wooden slats. Catherine Peveril didn't come with the hesitant step of a woman meeting a blackmailer. She moved with the cold, lethal purpose of a predator. As she stepped into the threshold of the boathouse, the moonlight caught the silver gleam of a heavy service revolver in her hand, a relic of her late husband's military days, no doubt kept for just such a domestic emergency. "Macbeth?" she shouted, her voice echoing strangely in the hollow space. "I have the money you requested, and the assurances for your future. Come out and show me where you've hidden the photograph. Let us finish this business so we can both go back to our lives." Hamish remained in the shadows, his voice drifting from a corner as if he were part of the stone itself. "It's a heavy thing, a legacy, isn't it, Mrs. Peveril? To kill a man just because he found out the foundations of your house were built on sand. Julian Montgomery was a snake, aye, but he didn't deserve to die with a mouthful of stale pie just to satisfy your sense of social superiority." The woman spun toward his voice, the barrel of the revolver level and steady. He was going to destroy centuries of Peveril history for a few offshore accounts. He was a vulgar little man who thought he could buy his way into a world he didn't understand. "And you, Macbeth, you're just another part of the scenery that needs pruning. Where is the photo?" "There is no photo here, Catherine," Hamish said, stepping into a sliver of grey light. His face was no longer the mask of a simpleton. It was hard, tiring, and profoundly disappointing. "And there is no money. There is only a digital recorder in my pocket and a pair of detectives from Strathbane who have been sitting in the rafters for the last 20 minutes. I told MacNab and Anderson that if they wanted to get out from under Blair's thumb, they should follow me. It seems they took the bait." For a heartbeat, the air in the boathouse turned to ice. Catherine Peveril's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine terror piercing through her aristocratic armour. But the terror didn't lead to surrender, it led to a wild, desperate rage. She levelled the gun at Hamish's chest, her finger tightening on the trigger. "I won't be humiliated by a village policeman," she hissed. Before she could fire, Lugs launched himself from the shadows. The dog didn't bite, but his sudden barking charge was enough to spoil her aim. The shot rang out, the bullet splintering a wooden beam inches from Hamish's head. Hamish didn't hesitate. Despite his deceptive laziness, he was a man of the hills, possessed of a sudden, wiry strength. He lunged forward, his large hand clamping down on the woman's wrist with the force of an iron trap, twisting the weapon away before she could chamber another round. The struggle was brief and ungraceful. Mrs. Peveril fought with the frantic strength of the doomed, scratching and cursing in a voice that had lost all its refinement. But Hamish held firm, pinning her against the dank stone wall as the heavy boots of detectives Macnab and Anderson thundered down from the upper loft. They swarmed over her, the metal click of handcuffs sounding like a final curtain call in the silence of the glen. Hamish stepped back, breathing hard, his ginger hair plastered to his forehead by the mist. He looked at the gun lying on the floor and then at the broken woman being led away. She was shouting about her lawyers, her connections, and the ruin of the Macbeth name, but Hamish wasn't listening. He walked to the edge of the pier, looking out over the silent Loch. The Sassenach was dead, the lady of the manor was a murderer, and Geordie the stonemason was likely still sitting in a cell, wondering why the world had gone mad. Lugs, Hamish sighed, patting the dog's head as the blue lights of the police cars began to flash through the trees. We've done the work, but now comes the hard part. We have to make sure DCI Blair thinks this was all his idea, or he'll be walking a beat in Glasgow by Monday morning. The blue lights of the police cruisers sliced through the Highland fog, turning the swirling mist into a frantic, pulsing strobe. DCI Blair's car arrived last, its tyres screaming on the gravel as it skidded to a halt. He practically tumbled out of the vehicle, his tie askew and his face a shade of plum that suggested his cardiovascular system was nearing its absolute limit. He arrived just as Macnab and Anderson were leading a dishevelled, silent Catherine Peveril toward the transport van. The sight of the village's most prominent aristocrat in handcuffs seemed to short-circuit Blair's brain for several seconds. He looked at the gun in Macnab's evidence bag, then at the lady of the manor, and finally at Hamish, who was standing by the pier with his hands in his pockets, looking as though he had just spent the last hour watching the tide come in.
"What is the meaning of this?"
Blair roared, his voice cracking with indignation.
"I told you to process the stonemason."
"I told you the case was closed. Why are you harassing Mrs. Peveril? This is a career-ending blunder. Macbeth, he'll have your badge for breakfast." Hamish took a slow, deliberate breath, shifting his weight and adopting a look of profound, wide-eyed confusion.
Oxer. Sir, I'm just as surprised as you are. It's a terrible misunderstanding, I'm sure.
You see, I was just out here checking on the boathouser part of the routine patrol you always insist on, and I found Macnab and Anderson already here. It turns out, sir, that your brilliant theory about local connectivity was even more accurate than we realized. You were right all along that the killer had to be someone with deep roots in the land. Blair paused, his mouth hanging open as he processed the sudden pivot. My theory. Indeed, sir, Hamish continued, his voice dripping with a honeyed, rustic sincerity. I was just telling the lads how Youd predicted the killer would try to frame a local like Geordie. You said to yourself it was too primitive and messy. It was your focus on the psychological profile of the killer that led them to keep an eye on the estate. They were just following the breadcrumbs you laid out during that briefing at the station. When Mrs. Peveril came here to confess and dispose of the weapon, they were ready, all because of your leadership, sir. Macnab and Anderson exchanged a quick, knowing glance. They were tired of Blair's shouting and even more tired of the paperwork that followed his failures. If giving Blair the credit meant they got to go home early and Geordie got released without a scandal reflecting on the department, they were more than happy to play along. That's right, sir, Macnab chimed in, suppressing a grin. We just followed your hunch about the high-profile nature of the victim. We knew Youd want us to cover all the bases while you were busy, coordinating the primary arrest. Blair straightened his jacket, his chest swelling with a sudden, unearned pride. The purple hue of his face began to fade into a smug, self-satisfied pink. Well, he huffed, clearing his throat. I did say the crime was a caricature. I knew the stonemason was too obvious. A professional detective looks beyond the surface, Macbeth. It's a shame you didn't see it yourself, but I suppose someone has to keep the coffee warm at the station while the real work is being done. Exactly, sir, Hamish said, touching the brim of his cap in a gesture of humble submission. It's a masterclass in detection. He'll be sure to tell the chief constable how your aggressive surveillance strategy was what finally broke the lady of the manor. Though, of course, a promotion to a big city precinct like Glasgow would probably be the only way to truly reward such a result. But then, a man of your talents is likely destined for even greater things than a Highland station anyway. The mention of Glasgow made Blair's eyes light up with the fires of ambition, while the subtle hint that Hamish was too slow to be promoted alongside him ensured the constable's safety. Blair barked a series of redundant orders to his team, eager to get back to Strathbane and claim his victory before the morning papers were printed. He didn't even look back as he climbed into his car, his mind already drafting the press release that would make him the hero of the Peveril murder. As the taillights vanished into the mist, a profound silence returned to the Loch. Macnab patted Hamish on the shoulder. You're a devious man, Macbeth. You just gave him a career while he thinks he's doing you a favor by leaving you in this rain-soaked hole. It's a fair trade, Mac Nab, Hamish replied softly, watching the ripples on the water. He gets a shiny new title in a city full of smog, and I get to stay here where the air is clean and the fish don't ask for my identification. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I have a very important appointment with a pot of stew and a dog who's earned his dinner. The sun finally managed to burn a ragged hole through the Sutherland mists, casting a pale, watery gold light over the whitewashed cottages of Loch. The village felt lighter, as if the departure of DCI Blair's noisy convoy had lifted a physical weight from the glen. In the police station, the cells were empty again. Geordie the stonemason had been released with a gruff apology from a junior officer and a firm handshake from Hamish, who had quietly suggested that perhaps a man with such a fine set of knives should keep them under a sturdier lock and key in the future. Hamish sat in his small kitchen, the ancient linoleum floor gleaming from a hasty mop. The air was filled with the rich, savoury aroma of a mutton stew that had been simmering on the stove for the better part of the afternoon. Lugs lay stretched out in a patch of sunlight by the door, his tail occasionally thumping against the floorboards in his sleep. The dog had already been rewarded with the remains of the evidence Puhitch Hamish had carefully retrieved from the crime, seen after the forensic teams had finished their clumsy done seined. He looked thoroughly satisfied with the turn of events. There was a light knock at the door, and Priscilla Halberton-Smythe stepped in, looking as crisp and elegant as a winter morning. She carried a small basket of scones, still warm from the oven of the big house. She looked around the humble kitchen, her gaze lingering on the mismatched mugs and the stack of well-thumbed books on the table. "I hear the hero of Strathbane is currently toasted in every pub from here to Inverness," she said, her voice carrying that familiar, teasing lilt. DCI Blair is apparently telling anyone who will listen that he personally broke Catherine Peveril's spirit with a 5-hour interrogation. He's already been invited to a gala in Edinburgh. Hamish poured her a cup of coffee, the real kind she had gifted him earlier. The DCI is a man of many talents, Priscilla, and one of them is believing his own press. It's better this way. If the world knew it was a lazy village bobby who cornered the lady of the manor, the chief constable would have me in a suit and a desk in Glasgow before I could finish my stew. And I've grown quite fond of the rain here. Priscilla sat across from him, her expression softening. You played a dangerous game, Hamish. Catherine wasn't just defending her money, she was defending an idea of herself. When you took that away, you were lucky she didn't take your head with her. Why do you do it? Why solve it at all if you're just going to let a man like Blair steal the glory? Hamish looked out the window at the loch, where a lone heron was standing perfectly still among the reeds, because Geordie is a good man, and he wouldn't have survived a year in a city prison, and because people like Julian Montgomery and Catherine Peveril think they can treat the Highlands like a stage set where the locals are just the furniture. I like to remind the landscape and myself that the furniture has a bit of a bite. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the distant cry of a gull. Priscilla eventually rose to leave, pausing at the door to look back at him. You're a strange man, Hamish Macbeth. You have the mind of a philosopher and the soul of a poacher. One day, you might find that Loch isn't big enough to hide you. I'll cross that bridge when the mist clears, Priscilla, he replied with a wink. After she had gone, Hamish served himself a bowl of the thick stew, the steam fogging his glasses. He sat back in his chair, feeling the deep, marrow-deep fatigue of the last 48 hours finally begin to settle. The Sassenach was gone, the insurance woman had disappeared back to the city with her secrets, and the social order of the village had been restored, albeit with a few more scars. He reached down to scratch Lugs behind the ears. The dog groaned in contentment. Outside, the Highland wind began to pick up, whistling through the eaves of the station house. It was a cold, lonely sound, but to Hamish, it was the sound of home. He had no medals, no promotions, and his bank account was as empty as ever. But as he took a sip of his coffee and looked at the fire, he knew he had won the only thing that mattered. He had another day of peace in the glen, a full pot of stew, and the knowledge that, for now at least, the secrets of Loch were safe with him.